Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The War Before Independence, 1775 to 1776, by Derek W. Beck, narrated by David Colacci. Preface. While this book can be enjoyed on its own, it is a continuation of the story left off in Igniting the American Revolution, 1773 to 1775. As described more fully in that volume's preface, I strive to paint events in this series with accuracy and objectivity. Such an unbiased approach will at times suggest the Americans are the bad guys and the British the good guys. I embrace these shades of gray to present both sides of the war as authentically as possible, and my extensive research includes both Yankee and British perspectives. For the same reason, I generally avoid the word patriot, which means a lover of one's country, because both sides were fighting to maintain, and for the love of, their respective lands or empire. My hope is that this provides an honest look at the events of the early war. Some listeners may prefer to adhere to the perspective of older history books that paint the Americans as superheroes, and thus call me an Anglophile for this unbiased attempt. But I think my continued honorable service in the modern American military refutes any such claims. Rather, I would prefer to be called a lover of truth. Sadly, I can find no word for this. Veritophile? Truth is where real history is to be found. Part 1. Commitment to War. Mid-May to October 1775. Chapter 1. Mounting Tensions. The great schism that had formed between Britons and Americans tore holes in friendships and families. One lady of Philadelphia wrote to a British officer in Boston, "I assure you that though we consider you as a public enemy, we regard you as a private friend, and while we detest the cause you are fighting for, we wish well to your own personal interest and safety." Benjamin Franklin felt this schism more directly. When he first arrived in London, he was the most noted and celebrated American, but when he left there in mid-March of 1775, he did so as a dejected outcast. This great schism was more than just a political or professional upheaval for Franklin. It also divided his own family. When he arrived in Philadelphia in early May, he cast his lot firmly with the Whigs, joining the Second Continental Congress as a Pennsylvania delegate. But Franklin's 44-year-old son, William Franklin, who as a young man had stood by his father during his famous lightning storm kite experiment, was now the royal governor of New Jersey and a staunch loyalist. The political turmoil that would tear apart the colonies from their mother country would likewise tear apart this son from his father. This schism was never more apparent than in and around Boston. After the destruction of the tea in December 1773, Britain overreacted by closing the port of Boston and placing large numbers of troops in the town. Tensions grew as quickly as the British garrison, and on April 19, 1775, when the British attempted to disarm the American war stores in nearby Concord, those tensions erupted into open violence, thus igniting the American Revolution. American militia forces swarmed from the countryside and chased the British back to Boston, where both sides now dug in for war, literally. While the Americans concentrated their entrenching efforts in and around nearby Cambridge to protect their new headquarters, the British fortified Boston Neck and all the hills in the peninsular town. Besides entrenching, the Americans devoted their attention to the organization of their militia forces. On May 19, 1775, Major General Artemus Ward, the highest-ranking man in the Massachusetts militia, was bestowed the honor of First Commander-in-Chief of the Massachusetts Army, and so promoted to full general. Ward received a small ceremony to mark the occasion. As John Adams described it, Dr. Joseph Warren made a harangue in the form of a charge in the presence of the assembly to every officer upon the delivery of his commission, and he never failed to make the officer, as well as all the assembly, shudder upon those occasions. A few days later, John Thomas, commander of the Massachusetts forces based in Roxbury, immediately across from the British via Boston Neck, was promoted to the No. 2 position, receiving the rank of lieutenant general in the new Massachusetts Army. The Massachusetts Army was just a portion of the grander New England Army of Observation, an eclectic collection of men representing the spectrum of New England society. From out-of-work longshoremen, weather-worn farmers, and decrepit millers, to youthful blacksmith apprentices, refined gentlemen lawyers, and zealous doctors. Young and old, green recruit and hardened veteran of the French and Indian War, opportunist and patriot, adventurer and reluctant soldier, together they represented every lifestyle. Almost none wore uniforms. Instead, most wore diverse homespun clothes, a product not of the late recession resulting from the closing of Boston's port, but of the spirited Yankee refusal to accept finished goods from England. Most were Protestant Christians of one denomination or another. Unremarkably, most were also white men, descendants of European settlers, though not all. A small number were black men who joined the army, some perhaps as free men, most as slaves enlisted in the stead of their masters. Members of the domesticated Mohican, or Mohican, Indian tribe of western Massachusetts, living then modern lives and locally known as Stockbridge Indians, also joined the camp, as did a few others from various tribes. The men were not the only thing conspicuously eclectic about the American army. Reverend William Emerson, whose old manse stood overlooking the fight at Concord's North Bridge, wrote, "It is diverting to walk among the camps. They are as different in their form as the owners are in their dress, and every tent is a portraiture of the temper and taste of the persons who encamp in it. Some are made of boards and some of sailcloth, some partly of one and partly of the other. Again, others are made of stone and turf, brick or bush. Some are thrown up in a hurry, others curiously wrought with doors and windows, done with wreaths and withes, twigs, in the manner of a basket. Some are your proper tents and marquees, looking like the regular camp of the enemy. In these are the Rhode Islanders, who are furnished with tent equipage and everything in the most exact English style. However, I think this great variety rather a beauty than a blemish in the army." The then small Harvard College also dedicated its few buildings to the American army, which used them for the commissary, mess, and as officer barracks. Every day the Americans eyed their rivals across the Charles River, and sometimes the ill-disciplined Yankees fired a few pot-shots to harass the British in Boston. These shots had no physical effect on the British, the range was too great, but they did serve as psychological warfare against the Americans' besieged enemy. In fact, the Americans would be quite ingenious at times with psychological warfare. Lieutenant John Barker of the British was particularly galled when he heard the rebels had erected the British Union flag in Cambridge. As Barker explained in his diary, "They call themselves the King's troops, and us the Parliament's." Pretty burlesque. In Boston, Lieutenant General Thomas Gage was well aware of much of the inner workings of the colonial leadership in Cambridge, thanks to his stifled but still functional spy network. By the end of April, Gage had received critical intelligence warning that some Yankees were discussing an attack on Boston, particularly from Dorchester Heights, which stood on a peninsula just south of Boston. Yet he had received intelligence just days earlier explicitly stating that there were no such talks of an American attack. In other words, something had changed. No doubt it was the arrival of Benedict Arnold, with his scheme to collect cannon with which to bombard the town. By mid-May, Gage received further intelligence that the Americans were urging Boston's inhabitants to leave town within days if they could, or suffer the consequences from an intended bombardment. There was no truth to this, but Gage had to take all such warnings seriously, so he redoubled the troop guards throughout the town. Still more intelligence described a rebel scheme to fortify the heights of the two nearby peninsulas, to the north at Charlestown, namely Bunker Hill, and to the south at Dorchester. As if to punctuate the accuracy of Gage's intelligence, on May 13th, in broad daylight, American Brigadier General Israel Putnam defiantly marched at the head of some 2,000 or more men across Charlestown Neck and into what had become an unspoken but understood neutral ground between the two armies. Putnam led his procession over Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, and paraded there with much pomp and circumstance, their drums and fifes blaring marching songs, all in full view of the armed British sentries in Boston, the watchful heavy cannon of the Admiral's battery on Copp's Hill, and the many ready cannon of HMS Somerset on the Charles. As the Americans marched on display, another 300 appeared in the Cambridge marshes across from Boston Common, parading in much the same way. At length, Putnam and his men marched to Charlestown itself and up to the very shores of the Charles, directly across from the Somerset, and, after giving the war-whoop opposite the Somerset, returned as they came. As Lieutenant Barker wrote in his diary, it was expected the body of Charlestown would have fired on the Somerset, at least it was wished for, as she had everything ready for action, and must have destroyed great numbers of them, besides putting the town in ashes. Doubtless, some among the Americans equally wished for battle, but it was not to be. According to Amos Farnsworth, one of the Americans there on the march, they had paraded only to show themselves to the regulars. Old Put, as his friends called him, was not foolish for leading such a march. Rather, it built confidence among the mostly green Yankee army. But just as important, it kept the men active. Putnam's experience had taught him that raw and undisciplined troops must be employed in some way, or they would become vicious and unmanageable. It is better to dig a ditch every morning and fill it up at evening than to have the men idle, was a maxim he had adopted. So, while Putnam kept his men busy building 2 redoubts he called Forts No. 1 and No. 2, both near Phipps Farm at Lechmere Point in Cambridge, the march was a much-welcomed break from the routine of entrenching. In this way, Putnam also helped boost morale, and the men who served with him grew to wholly trust his leadership. He does not wear a large wig, nor screw his countenance into a form that belies the sentiments of his generous soul. He is no adept either at politics or religious canting and cousining. He is no shake-hand body. He therefore is totally unfit for everything but fighting. Finally, the Americans were just as fearful the British might take Charlestown Heights as the British were of the Americans. So while Putnam's march taunted the British, it also allowed the Yankees to reconnoiter and familiarize themselves with that ground, should a battle for that peninsula soon come. For this same reason, General Ward sent a warning to Lieutenant General John Thomas in Roxbury, that should the British sally from the town and endeavor to secure Dorchester Heights, the other implicit neutral ground to the south, Thomas should be ready at a moment's notice to repulse such an enterprise. Thomas assured his commander-in-chief, "The information is similar to what I have received almost every day this 10 days past. I have had for some time near 200 men posted near the neck, and 200 more as a picket that repair there every night, and part of 2 regiment more, not more than a mile and a half distant from the place, and am determined to take all possible care to prevent their taking possession." From the British perspective, Putnam's march, combined with the latest intelligence, strongly supported the likelihood of a rebel plot. Hence, Gage's new adjutant-general, Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie, lately arrived ahead of his 22nd Regiment that was itself bound for New York, decided to take a longboat up the Charles River to reconnoiter the American lines. According to Lieutenant Barker, Abercrombie's men were fired upon by several of the rebels from the banks. Several balls went through the boat, but nobody was hurt. They made the best of their way back, and I don't hear that he has been as fond of reconnoitering since. Barker later noted of the rebels, "Some of the idle fools frequently fire small arms at the HMS Glasgow and at our camp. Us they never reach, but they sometimes stick a ball in the ship, who never returns it, though she has it in her power to drive 'em to the devil." Meanwhile, all throughout May, British troops began to leave their winter barracks and again set up their white tents on and around Boston Common. While this was to be an orderly affair, in mid-May a fire swept through the barracks of the 65th Regiment, destroying much of their arms, gear, and clothing, and forcing them to encamp on the Common sooner than expected. There were many advantages to moving the men into summer quarters, such as a healthy respite from being cooped up with so many soldiers in close quarters, and the savings that came from relinquishing rented barracks. In addition, the Common was closer to Boston Neck and the Charles River, so the troops there were in a better position to guard against rebel incursions. The month of May also brought new troops to Boston. First, 4 more companies of the 65th had redeployed from Halifax and arrived on May 6th. Then on May 14th, the first 2 transports arrived of what would be the first embarkation of fresh troops in 1775, bringing with them a portion of almost 700 fresh Marines and officers. Within the next few days, 4 more transports arrived with the remaining Marines. Once they had all arrived, Marine Major John Pitcairn divided the Marines evenly into 2 battalions of 10 companies each, mimicking the Army regiments. The veteran Marines and some of the new ones were now officially named the 1st Battalion and placed under Pitcairn, who also retained overall command of the Marines, while the bulk of the new arrivals formed the 2nd Battalion under Major John Tupper. The remainder of the first embarkation would arrive within weeks, supplying another 3 full Army regiments plus cavalry, an addition of nearly 1,500 fresh men and officers. Lieutenant Richard Williams was one of those who arrived with the first embarkation. After assessing the toll taken on the town by the siege, he wrote in his journal that Boston was a fair town, but, "As to public buildings, I can't say they shine much. The Town House, Old State House, and Faneuil Hall are the only 2 worth notice, and are of bricks. Some churches have very neat and elegant steeples of wood. No such thing as a playhouse. They were too puritanical a set to admit of such lewd diversions, though there's perhaps no town of its size could turn out more whores than this could. They have left us an ample sample of them. I walked through the town and was much affected at the sight of it, in a manner abandoned, almost every other shop shut up. The trade of Boston must have been very extensive and of great consequence. The great number of storehouses and wharfs, which are contiguous to them, shows it plainly, if there were not other proofs. I can't help looking on it as a ruined town, and I think I see the grass growing in every street." With the troops besieged on a small peninsula, their only diversion was the dreaded and ubiquitous New England rum. Once again drunkenness became a problem among the British ranks, eroding troop discipline. Gage soon learned that the women camp-followers, the many soldiers' wives, and the ample prostitutes in town were among the leading suppliers. Consequently, he issued stern orders that his officers should strictly investigate all incidents of drunkenness, and that any woman who did not observe the prohibition to sell rum and liquor to the soldiers was to be immediately seized and put on board ship. The other great burden Gage faced was that of provisions for his army. So far the army had plenty of salt-cured meats and dry goods. There was no crisis yet. But Gage's army was in need of fresh vegetables and fruit, of which they had none, and without which the town would eventually succumb to scurvy. Still, while the supply of fresh goods from the countryside had been cut off at the start of the siege, some continued to trickle in through Boston Neck, thanks to a handful of industrious Yankees eager for cash. Gage also needed fresh meat for his army, not a necessity for survival, but crucial to maintain troop morale. The disappearance of a pair of oxen at the north end gave proof of the growing desperation for fresh meat and provisions. The one critical provision the army desperately lacked was hay, necessary for the horses and few livestock remaining in town. So Gage devised a plan to secure a supply from nearby Grape Island in the harbor. It was meant to be a routine foraging mission, but once again Gage underestimated the Americans. Grape Island lay just off the mainland near the town of Weymouth in the far south of Boston Harbor, nearly 10 miles by boat from Boston's Long Wharf. Gage seems to have determined on that particular hay because it was made available to him by the owner, a Tory named Lovell. On May 20th, a British detachment of 30 men under Lieutenant Thomas Innes of the 43rd embarked aboard a sloop, with its 12 guns removed, and set sail southward. The sloop dropped anchor off Grape Island, and there they remained for the night. Lieutenant Innes planned to conduct his raid the following morning, a Sabbath, expecting the local colonists to be at church. Accordingly, at perhaps 8 o'clock on May 21st, once the tide had sufficiently ebbed, the crew floated their longboats and rowed to the island, grinding them to a halt on the expansive mudflats. The detachment of 30 British then began hauling away the pre-cut hay, but at 70 or 80 tons it was more than they could take. Had they planned better, they might have taken some of the cattle there, too. In the nearby mainland town of Weymouth, the militia learned of the raid and raised the alarm, which rippled through the coastal towns all the way back to Roxbury and Cambridge. At 10 o'clock, General John Thomas in Roxbury received an urgent express, giving the exaggerated report that 4 British sloops, 2 armed, were landing troops at Weymouth. This was false, of course, but Thomas could take no chances, so he ordered 3 companies to march to Weymouth. Dr. Joseph Warren learned of the march and eagerly joined them as a volunteer. The Weymouth militia mustered at a point of land that reached closest to Grape Island. However, because it was now low tide, the few sailboats there were all beached on their sides. The Americans were thus powerless to stop the British. All they could do was glare across those mudflats and harbor waters to the hayfields of Grape Island and the bright red coats gathering hay on the island's opposite side. Though the British were well out of range, the Yankees fired a concerted volley, followed by scattered potshots, all without effect. The British sloop fired its small defensive swivel guns in return, also without effect. As Dr. Warren anonymously reported later to the Essex Gazette, matters continued in this state for several hours, the soldiers pulling the hay down to the waterside, our people firing at the vessel, and they, now and then, swivel guns. But once the tide sufficiently flooded, sometime around 2 o'clock, the maroon sailboats along the Weymouth shore at last floated. The militia eagerly boarded them, hoisted sails, and began to make their way to Grape Island. The British hurried to collect a bit more hay, then scurried toward the shoreline. Only now did Lieutenant Innes order his detachment to fire, but their volley had no effect. They then climbed aboard the longboats and rowed to their sloop, which promptly weighed anchor, just as the Americans landed on the small island's opposite shore. The Yankees rushed across the island toward the British, firing their muskets as they did so, while the sloop gave scattered swivel shot in return. Another small arms exchange came as the sloop passed around a point of land toward Boston to the north, and then the affair was over. In all, the British stole away about 7 or 8 tons of hay, while the Americans burned the remaining 70 tons or so and herded away the few cattle. The King's army could have done better, but the raid was bloodless, despite claims by both sides that they had killed a handful of the other. The British perhaps considered the Grape Island raid a success, but the Americans were now wise to the British agenda to raid the harbor islands, many of which served as pasture lands for cattle and other livestock. As a result, the Yankees would soon begin removing the herds from the other outlying islands, thereby depriving the redcoats of their greatest source of fresh meat and making another showdown with the British inevitable. With both adversaries growing ever more determined to press the war, the Massachusetts provincial government made a monumental decision regarding Tories, or those persons guilty of such atrocious and unnatural crimes against their country. On May 22nd, the Provincial Congress resolved that every friend to mankind ought to forsake and detest them, and that, until they shall give evidence of a sincere repentance, no person within this colony shall take any deed, lease, or conveyance whatever of the lands, houses, or estates of such persons. With this resolution, loyalism was effectively made illegal. Freedom of political thought, taken for granted by the modern, was now a crime, and all Tories were deemed outcasts unless they satisfactorily repented. Implicit within this resolution, whenever Tories abandoned their usual homes, they were not driven from them, the Provincial Congress was free to confiscate their private property for the cause. About 15 to 20% of white Americans are estimated to have been true loyalists, perhaps on the lower end of that scale in New England, while the Whigs comprised no more than 45% of the population. Thus, the extra-legal Provincial Congress, which spoke for only half of Massachusetts' population, had now stripped the rights of another sizable fraction of its people. It is one of the hypocrisies of the Revolution that those who fought for liberty did so by stamping out the liberty of others. By mid-May, the delegates of the Provincial Congress began to devote more of their attention to the legitimacy of prosecuting the war. Though the Congress had assumed governance of the colony and now controlled an army, its delegates were ever mindful of legality, or at least the semblance of legality, and were loath to make any attack on the British without such. Hence they wrote a petition to the Continental Congress, imploring that higher body to assume responsibility for civil government in Massachusetts, and explicitly direct their Provincial Congress on how best to proceed. Their petition further expressed, "We tremble at having an army, although consisting of our own countrymen, established here, without a civil power to provide for and control it." To hand-deliver this petition to Philadelphia, the colony appointed the trusted Whig, but secret British spy, Dr. Benjamin Church. Though he was the most obvious appointee, being the chairman of the Committee of Safety, the errand was much to his vexation, perhaps because he was forced to actively aid the side he was working to undermine. Indeed, the Massachusetts Congress had no legal authority over the regiments of the other colonies of Connecticut, New Hampshire, or Rhode Island, some of which were not yet arrived. Rather, these several provincial armies were bound only by the common cause, and thus served together only by their own volition. It was therefore necessary that the Continental Congress adopt the loosely assembled New England army as a Continental army, and assign for it a generalissimo as commander-in-chief. Such a generalissimo would then have legitimate authority to command all the regiments, regardless of the colony from which they hailed. Dr. Joseph Warren decided to write privately to Samuel Adams on the matter, wishing to explain a bit more than was proper for an official petition. "I would just observe that the application made to you respecting the taking the regulation of this army into your hands by appointing a committee of war, or taking the command of it by appointing a generalissimo, is a matter, I think, must be managed with some delicacy. I am a little suspicious, unless great care is taken, some dissensions may arise in the army, as our soldiers, I find, will not yet be brought to obey any person of whom they do not themselves entertain a high opinion. Subordination is absolutely necessary in an army, but the strings must not be drawn too tight at first." A week later, Warren wrote a second letter, adding, "I see more and more the necessity of establishing a civil government here, and such a government as shall be sufficient to control the military forces, not only of this colony, but also such as shall be sent to us from the other colonies. The continent must strengthen and support with all its weight the civil authority here.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?